Welcome to Acton In Focus for yet another special edition of Acton's History with none other than Mr. Dean Chatter here, and we are at the West Acton Citizens Library. Welcome to the show, Dean.
Thank you.
This is an extension, a continuation of our conversations about Acton's history, and right now we are standing at the Acton Citizens Library. So let's start there.
Okay.
What is the history of this place?
So the Citizens Library started out as a private organization back in the 1880s, and they had a little reading room on top of one of the buildings in West Acton Square. And in 1883, this building here was donated to the Citizens Library Association. It was not part of the town, and it was all sort of a local village operation. This area here that we're on, Windsor Avenue, was sort of the epicenter of the West Acton Village Improvement Association. And the Improvement Association, in addition to working on the library, they were concerned about sidewalks and roads and street lights and that sort of thing. A lot of the infrastructure that normally is considered to be local government now was more of a private operation.
How long ago was that?
Well, that would have been in the 1870s and the 1880s.
Oh, okay.
And at that point, the entire town of Acton had a population of about 2,000 people. Now we're at 24,000.
Yes.
So it's a big change.
A little change, yeah.
So this building here was donated by Phineas Weatherby to become a library. And initially, the library was just one room on the ground floor. And over the years, it expanded a bit. And in 1961, the building was turned over to the town. The private organization went out of business. It became an actual town department, and they set up a board of library trustees that are voted in every year at town meeting. So it's closely related to the Memorial Library in Acton Center, but it has its own very distinct personality. Just look at the size of the building and the services that they provide.
What are some of those distinct services?
Well, in this building here, there's not a big reference section. It's more of what Jennifer Friedman used to call a reader's library. So it's a lot of novels, a lot of mysteries, big children's section, and some nonfiction. And just recently, in the last year, they became part of the Minuteman Library Network. So you can actually order books from the network and you can pick them up here.
That's amazing. In addition to the library, and speaking of mystery, well, it's not quite a mystery, but right in front of us is the fire station. What is the history of that place?
So the fire station was built in 1904, and this was when you still just had all volunteer departments. And the building, that was the West Acton Fire Station until the early 1960s, when they built the one that's on Central Street now. So in about 1960, it got turned over and it went to various uses. For 1 year or 2 years, it was a teen center. And then for a while, it was the headquarters for the Acton Minutemen. And then after that, it became food pantry. And finally, about 15 years ago, the town took it back. And we got some considerable amount of money from the Community Preservation Committee to rehab it and restore it. So that building right there, as you see it, looks nothing like it did when we took it over 15 years ago. We had to reproduce those doors. The doors in the front of the building actually swing inward.
Oh, nice.
And now it's used as a storage area for library book sales. But there's been some consideration that it might end up getting used for some more active use as library facility, programming. There's been lots of different ideas. We're actually, Jen Friedman, our longtime librarian, retired. We now have a new library director at the Memorial Library, and we're looking at a closer cooperation between the two libraries. So sort of the sky is the limit as far as what could be done over there.
Right.
So that's the that's sort of what's going on with it. Two-story building, very traditional for a fire station. Upstairs they used to have the bean suppers. There actually was a kitchen upstairs.
Bean suppers?
Bean suppers, ham and beans.
Uh-huh.
They'd have their drill nights, and then they'd have their ham and bean suppers afterwards. And it was right here in the center because when it was built, you figure 1904, there were not a lot of vehicles here. So it needed to be close so that if there was a fire, everybody could run to the building, get the fire equipment, take it out, and fight the fire right here in the village.
Right.
And soon after that building was built, there was a considerable fire that burned down a number of these buildings over here. Mm-hmm. There were a series of fires that would get going, and the fire equipment was not that sophisticated. The water supply wasn't that good. So there tended to be quite a few fires in these village centers. And so this was sort of a critical piece of infrastructure.
What were the main causes of these fires?
Well, looking at the history of them, there used to be a lot of blacksmith shops here.
Yeah.
So you'd have fires get start from that. There was a lot of storage of hay. Mm-hmm. And if the hay was green when it was stored, it would heat up inside the barns.
Yep. And
through spontaneous combustion it would get going. A lot of these buildings here had unlined chimneys, so you'd get a chimney fire going. And one of the other things that happened right here is we've got the train tracks right behind the fire station. And of course in the early days, when they were using coal, there'd be sparks would come out of the engines as they go by and start small fires during the droughty season.
Right.
And then the other thing that happened was, even when I was a young kid, you get a brake would be dragging on one of the fire engines or one of the freight cars, and it would create heat and sparks would fly out. And sometimes there'd be fires that would be starting, you'd be able to track where the train went.
Right.
It would start in Boxborough and go all the way to Concord, and there'd be little brush fires all along the railroad tracks. So all of those things sort of added up.
As you're giving us this history, I just realized there's a lot of history in West Acton. What is, and it's one of the special places in the town of Acton. So what are some other special locations or events that have happened in West Acton?
Well, the big thing about West Acton Village is you have to realize it grew up organically. Before there was a lot of regulation, there was no zoning.
Yeah.
So you had a true mixed use here where there was housing, there was multifamily housing, there was retail use, there was some freight yards, and there was manufacturing, all here right close together.
And the train station.
And the train station. Right. The train station in West Acton, I remember when it was torn down in the mid-60s. The train station stood right where New London Style Pizza is now. And so when I was very small, my family owned a house up by the Baptist church. It was since torn down to make their parking lot. And I lived there for the first couple of years. And the story I heard from my folks, they kept reminding me of this forever, was the day that they were moving out to move to our new home on Haywood Road. They were packing everything up, loading up the truck, and little Dean wandered out. I was 2 years old. Went from where the Baptist church is now all the way down to the railroad tracks, and they found me standing at the railroad crossing watching the trains go by.
I'm just picturing you, a 2-year-old.
So yeah, I had the bright red hair at the time too. So at the time there were 2 railroad tracks there. There was freight. There was the train station. There was actually a siding from that freight line that went around kind of through the parking lot where Silver Unicorn Books is now, and went across Spruce Street and right down beside where Legend Cafe is. Yeah. And that was where they would back in freight cars. And some of my uncles, the Davis family, had a freight yard right there. So they would be shipping freight, picking up freight, and then in addition to what they were doing with the trains, they would take first wagons and then later on trucks all the way into the Haymarket in Boston to bring in produce. There was apples, asparagus, corn, any of the farm produce here would all end up going into Boston.
When you said your uncle, the Davis family, are you related to Isaac Davis?
You'd have to go way back. The branch of the Davis family that I'm related to came to Acton as immigrants back in the 1860s from Wales.
England.
So I think if you go back far enough, probably all the Davis families were all probably related in Wales, but you might have to go back 500 or 600 years.
No, I'll try not to go back that far.
But that kind of brings up another interesting thing about these centers. I mentioned my ancestors being immigrants coming here from Wales, and you look at some of the diverse populations that lived here in the village. Right across the parking lot from Legends Cafe, you can see a building which for a while was an architect's office. That was originally a Catholic church, St. Elizabeth's Church, and that got built in the 1920s when there was more of an influx of Catholics, Italian and Irish immigrants moving into this area, so they needed the church there. So that's why that got built there. And then if you look just down this end of the street at the Acton Pharmacy, that pharmacy got built when I was a small child. And Jake Stoller was the pharmacist. And he was probably one of the very early Jewish business people and professionals to move into the town. So we've always had a mixture of new folks moving in that didn't necessarily look like the old Protestant Yankees. So it's an interest, and obviously that mix continues.
Right.
But that's sort of a little bit of the background of that area. Some of the other transportation issues, obviously Mass Ave was sort of a turnpike going all the way from Boston all the way up towards Harvard. So there was a lot of wagon traffic and then eventually trains.
You've mentioned the churches, the different Catholic church, Protestant church. How has that evolved?
Well, I mean, as the population of the town increased, the various denominations increased in size. In the 60s, the new St. Elizabeth's Church was built down on Arlington Street, so that the parish moved there. Over next to the fire station is the building that's now Theater 3. And that was the West Acton Unitarian Universalist Society. So that was an old Protestant sect. And that was their church for many years. They finally combined with the church in South Acton. And then from there, that church combined with the parish over in Stowe.
Right.
One of the big major denominations here traditionally was the Baptist Church.
Right.
Right there at the corner of Central and Mass Ave. So there's always been a certain turnover, but obviously you go back 70, 80, 90 years and it was primarily Christian oriented.
Right.
Not as diverse as it is now.
I think it's still pretty much mostly Christian around here.
And one of the problems that I think a lot of these churches are facing is and it's not just here but throughout North America, is churches aren't as much of a draw as they used to be. Church attendance is down a lot, so it's just a change of society.
Around the Village Works, there's a lot of activity. And how has the town of Acton shaped West Acton, if at all? Or how has West Acton shaped the work of the town of Acton?
Well, I think people like the idea of a traditional village, and it's everybody's perception of what a traditional village is.
Right.
Folks who like the idea of a traditional village probably would be a little concerned when they realized that one of the big employers around here was next to Gardner Field, which was a cigar factory. And over where Sal's Automotive is.
Hey, train.
Yeah.
All right.
Over where Sal's Automotive is, on Central Street and Willow Street, that actually was a manufacturing, Hall Brothers, and they made, it was a sawmill, and they made apple boxes and sap buckets and that sort of thing. So there was actually manufacturing right here in the center of town.
All right.
But when I was growing up, talking about a small traditional village, we had really active grocery stores here. Up until the mid-1960s, there were no supermarkets in town. So I'd come down with my mother and we'd go to this grocery store, which is where Red, White and Brew is now.
Yeah.
And that's where we do most of our shopping. And if you wanted to do more shopping than that, you'd have to go to Maynard. Because they had some big stores there. But so it was a handy village to be in. You know, one of the things that we lost was at Acton Pharmacy. There used to be a soda fountain down there.
Soda.
So you go there and have, you know, get a Coke, get a ice cream sundae or any of that kind of stuff right there, the soda fountain where the prescription desk is now. So now, when you look at Village Works, a lot of that I think is trying to go back to the idea, a sort of romanticized idea of what West Acton Center used to be like.
Right.
You know, a place where people could hang around. You know, this used to be sort of a hangout, not only for kids but for adults. You know, and just
Right.
a lot of activity. People would drive, but they wouldn't drive as far as they do now. And back then, families that had cars usually had one car, and Dad would be taking it to work, so Mom would come down here to do the shopping or what have you. So it's sort of a different feel, but I think it's been a conscious effort on the part of the planning department and the planning board and the select board for years to try to draw West Acton back into that idea of a traditional downtown center with lots of commercial activity and some housing. You know, there's some new houses have come up here, just to give it that real small town feel.
What are some of the challenges of trying to create that small town feel in Acton?
Well, you know, one of the big challenges obviously is zoning, and there is specific zoning that allows this sort of work to go on, so that's not as much of a problem. It's encouraged smaller lots. It's encouraged shared use of parking spaces so you don't have to pave the entire center of town. But it's always controversial. When 2 new houses were built on Pearl Street, that had been somebody's side yard. And a lot of folks were upset because it was green space. It was not publicly owned green space, so it was green space. And now that's gone and there's 2 new houses there. So there's always pluses and minuses. If you want to have more commercial activity, you need to have a population base. And you need to have people that live right here and that can walk here and use the services. So it's always, every time something new happens, it doesn't fit with their concept of what the village should be like.
Right.
But I think, you know, we've got a critical mass of people now that really kind of like what's happening here. So I think that's been very, and it took a long time.
Right. So with that, I wanted to say that it's been great to have this first segment about the West Acton Village Center. We've talked about the library, the old fire station, the train station, and the community itself. So thank you, Dean, for speaking with me today on this special edition of Acton In Focus. And
thank you very much.
I look forward to having more of these conversations. And to our viewers, thank you for watching. Till next time.